With that, it's a pleasure to invite two more students of the Bet Medrash. Will Merovitz, Moshe Szilagyi, come here consistently every Sunday to learn Torah, to please share with us some words of Torah.
Okay, so Will and I decided to focus on a section that we study with Rabbi Levi from the RAMBAM. So the section that we are going to talk about deals with the requirement that a get, which is a Jewish bill of divorce, must be given willingly by the husband. So we're going to start by giving a halacha, discussing it a little, and then we're going to basically connect it to a Hasidic lesson at the end. So the RAMBAM describes a scenario where a man is required by Jewish law to give a get, but for whatever reason, he refuses or expresses unwillingness to do so. So, in such a case, the court is allowed to beat him until he consents to give the get. They're allowed to do basically whatever by force in order to force him to agree to give the document. It is written that if the get is written under these circumstances, it is still considered a valid get. So there are no problems with its ability to be a kosher get. This applies even if non-Jews are the ones physically forcing him, so long as they are doing so on behalf of the Jewish court or have been influenced by Jews to act in this way. However, if the non-Jews act independently or compel the husband to give a get purely based off their own will, the get is not valid since the coercion is unrelated to Torah. They may be forcing him because of the law or because of any other reasons that they may have. So this raises a big question that the RAMBAM himself addresses. How can the get be considered valid if the husband is being coerced? After all, Jewish law says that a get must be given voluntarily. The RAMBAM explains that coercion is only when someone is being forced to do something they are not obligated to do by the Torah, such as giving a gift or agreeing to a business transaction. In the case of a mitzvah, however, things are different. The RAMBAM writes that although it may seem that the man is being forced against his will, in truth, he does want to do the mitzvah of giving the get. His resistance doesn't come from his true will, but rather from his yetzer hara, his evil inclination. Right? So it's not coming from himself, it's coming from his inability to do something because of the yetzer hara. By forcing him, we're not making him do something against his will, rather we're helping him in this case overcome the internal resistance of his yetzer hara. The RAMBAM explains that deep down, every single Jew wants to be part of the Jewish people and fulfill all the mitzvahs. That way, because of this, when the husband finally says, I consent, after being forced, it is considered a genuine expression of his true will. Later commentators build on this and they debate the Rambam's view. So the Merovitz, a later halachic authority, questions this logic. He argues that if a Jew explicitly renounces Judaism or tries to convert, how can the Rambam's statement about how he deep down wants to be a Jew apply to this situation? Clearly doesn't want to keep the mitzvahs or even have anything to do with the Jewish people anymore. In such a case, the person would have no will to keep this mitzvah of doing a get, and the coercion would not reflect any internal desire to give a get. So basically the get would be invalid. The Maharik, a 15th century posek in Italy, agrees with the Merovitz that such a get would be invalid. However, this would present a serious halachic problem. The woman is now trapped in the marriage, she's unable to remarry or find any way out if the husband refuses to give a get. So, to solve this, the Maharik proposes a more radical idea. He proposes that maybe the Beit Din could retroactively annul the marriage. Basically, the woman would be free without needing a get. So the thing about this, however, which we're not really going to go on because it's going to lead to other halachic issues, is that it could possibly illegitimize the children of the relationship and could lead to broader halachic complications. Again, we're not going to go down that because it's going to lead to a whole separate link of issues, but it's interesting. Finally, we're going to talk about the CHAZZON. He's one of the leading halachic authorities of the previous generation. So he addresses the issue with a more philosophical perspective. The CHAZZON discusses the Rambam statement that deep down, a Jew really wants to fulfill all the mitzvahs and be part of the Jewish people. He argues that this can't really be taken literally, because if it were, then the person should be acting as a complete tzaddik, right? Since the Rambam wrote after he talks about the prohibition, the mitzvah of giving a get, he wrote that the reason that it counts is because deep down every Jew wants to fulfill every mitzvah and not do any averos, basically. So, if that were literal, every Jew would be acting as a perfect tzaddik. They would fulfill all the mitzvahs and do every avera. So clearly this can't be the case, because if he was a perfect tzaddik, why would he be deciding not to give a get? So the CHAZZON understands the Rambam's statement more philosophically. Even if someone has left Judaism or converted, the essence of their soul, their neshama, still yearns to be connected to Torah and mitzvahs. So this connection is what allows the get to be valid even after forcing him. So the CHAZZON approaches, this approach from the CHAZZON introduces a much deeper and more spiritual understanding of the Jewish soul. It brings the idea that regardless of external actions or beliefs, the soul still retains a deep internal will to stay connected to the Jewish people and the Jewish faith.
Like the CHAZZON said, the whole point of being allowed to persuade a man into giving a get is because every neshama wants to connect to Hashem deep down, even if it doesn't seem like it on the surface. Right? In the case of the man refusing to give his wife a get, on the outside, it looks like he's going against Judaism and kind of trying to distance himself from Hashem, which is why we're allowed to persuade him into giving it to her. And this idea doesn't only apply to someone who seems to be going against, but also to the more observant Jews. This concept of being allowed to force the man comes with belief that a neshama always wants to connect, even if the Jew isn't fully aware of it. Sometimes, as more observant Jews, we find ourselves doing mitzvahs out of habit or like a routine. But that's only what it looks like on the outside, on the surface. We do these mitzvahs because our neshama is constantly pulling us towards Hashem, which is why the action of doing the mitzvah is more important than the thoughts or the feelings we have while doing them, because it's what the neshama values the most. This is where the idea of a shliach comes from, because the Rebbe knew that everywhere there is a Jew, even if it didn't seem like it at all, there's a neshama wanting to connect. That's why when a shliach approaches a Jew and asks him to do a mitzvah, like putting on tefillin, if the Jew says no, the shliach can't leave it at that. He has to truly believe that inside that Jew saying no, there's a neshama dying to connect to Hashem. So he has to be more adamant about it. And this idea of the neshama wanting to connect is like a story of Rabbi Shalom Ber Shochet, who was a shliach in Toronto, and he was invited to give a talk in Buffalo. But he knew that the audience consisted of mostly non-Jews and leaders of other religions even. So at first, he didn't want to go because he thought that it was sort of a waste of time for someone who was focused on Jewish outreach to give a talk to a room of goyim. But when he asked the Rebbe was very persistent that he goes to give this talk. So he went and he gave it. And when he was giving this talk, he told a story of Yosele the miser, who was a Jew who he appeared to be very stingy and selfish, but he was secretly the source of almost all the charity in Krakow. And only after his death, his town realized that it had been him. So when Rabbi Shochet was done with this talk, a young priest went up to him and he asked him to tell the story again and again and again. And Rabbi Shochet was very confused by this priest's intensity, and he asked him why this story affected him so much. The priest then explained that before his mother passed away, she revealed that she was a Jew who hid her identity during the war. And she also shared a similar story about her grandfather, who was a man in Krakow who secretly gave charity, and then only after his death, the town found out. So this priest believed that Yosele the miser was actually his great-grandfather. So they left, and that was it. And then years later, Rabbi Shochet was visiting Israel. He was at the Kotel. He was approached by a bearded man. He said, Rabbi Shochet, Shalom Aleichem. He didn't know who he was, so he asked him, and the man said, you don't know me now, but you know my old self. He was the priest, and he is now a Breslover Chassid who is living in Israel. And when Rabbi Shochet saw this, he realized why the Rebbe was so persistent about him going to give this talk. Because the Rebbe knew that in that seemingly useless room, there could be one Jew in that audience who needed his neshama lit for it to be worth giving the talk. And there was. And this entire idea that every Jew, no matter how distant they may seem, truly wants to connect to Hashem is a foundation of so much we do in Judaism, whether it's persuading a man to give a get or a shliach reaching out to someone who says they're not interested. The deeper truth is that the neshama always yearns for its source, even when the body resists or when the mind says no. The neshama pulls a person towards Hashem in ways that sometimes aren't visible on the surface. And the story of Rabbi Shochet and the priest who turned out to be a hidden Jew is a perfect example of this truth. The Rebbe understood that there's no such thing as a Jew who's truly disconnected Only a Jew whose neshama is waiting for the right moment to awaken. And when that moment comes, it can transform a life, just like the priest to the chassid. That's why we can never give up another Jew, because deep down, every neshama is already reaching upward, just craving to come home. So we just have to make it happen.
Beautiful boys, Yesher Koyach. It's a perfect pitch for this afternoon at Hampstead Park, 4 o'clock. We have our tefillin booth at Hampstead Day with hundreds of Jews that are, as you just heard, waiting for their neshamas to be ignited and to put on tefillin and to do a mitzvah. So everybody's encouraged to join us at the park from 4 to 8 and help us volunteer at the park. Really, Yesher Koyach, beautiful boys.